Step into the world of Sherlock Holmes stories, your gateway to enthralling audio mysteries. Unravel the chilling enigma of Fireplace that burned backward, and lose yourself in an unforgettable listening journey. Chapter 1. The Impossible Flame. It was during the waning days of October, when the air hung damp over Baker Street, and the London fog clung to the city like the breath of some brooding giant, that the case of the reversed fireplace first made its bizarre appearance. I recall the morning vividly, for it was one of those dreary intervals between cases, and Holmes had fallen into one of his greyest moods, brooding in his armchair with neither pipe nor violin for comfort. His only companion for the better part of 2 hours had been a Turkish cigarette, which he allowed to smolder unnoticed between his fingers. "I abhor stagnation, Watson," he said suddenly, flicking the cigarette into the hearth with a trace of irritation. "The mind must work, else it corrodes. When there is no crime to solve, London becomes an unbearable museum of repetition." I was just preparing to offer some mild encouragement when a furious knocking resounded from the stairs, followed a moment later by the hasty entrance of Mrs. Hudson. "There's a gentleman here to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it's urgent, frightfully urgent." Holmes sat up at once, his grey eyes flashing with that singular glint of curiosity which only the scent of mystery could awaken. "Send him in at once, Mrs. Hudson." A moment later, our visitor burst in. A tall, ruddy-faced man, in his early 40s, impeccably dressed, but visibly shaken. His gloved hands trembled as he removed his top hat, and he cast quick, suspicious glances about the room, as though fearing an invisible enemy might follow on his heels. "My name is Edward Allerton," he announced. "I come on behalf of my employer, Lady Cordelia Sannox. There's been an occurrence, something that defies logic, explanation, or even nature." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "You intrigue me, Mr. Allerton. Kindly sit. Now, tell us what you mean by defies nature." Allerton obliged, though he could not keep from fidgeting with his watch chain as he began to speak. "It happened last night at Thistlebank Manor, the Sannox country estate near Haslemere. Lady Sannox had retired early, but her nephew, Mr. Gideon Winstanley, and I were in the drawing-room after dinner, taking brandy by the fire. At approximately 9:30, a most dreadful thing occurred. The fire reversed itself." "Reversed?" I asked, puzzled. "Yes, Dr. Watson." "The flames, instead of leaping upward as they should, turned downward into the hearth, and disappeared entirely within the iron grate. The smoke followed suit, curling backward into the fireplace instead of rising up the chimney. It was as if the fire had been sucked into the floor. A second later, the room filled with a stench so foul it caused Gideon to faint. And then—" He hesitated, swallowing visibly. "Go on," said Holmes softly. "We found something inside the fireplace, something that hadn't been there earlier." "What was it?" "A human tooth." There was a brief silence in the room. Holmes steepled, his fingers beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. "You're quite certain no one else had entered the room?" "Absolutely. The door was locked, and I had the key. There are no servants permitted in the drawing-room after 9, not since Lady Sannox inherited the estate and enforced her rules." Holmes tapped the armrest with one long finger. "And you say the fire behaved unnaturally?" "Yes, that is precisely the word I would use." "Any previous disturbances of this nature?" Allerton hesitated again. "There is a local superstition. The fireplace, you see, is original to the house, dates back to the late 17th century. The villagers refer to it as the mouth of backward flame. They say it once consumed a man whole, but Lady Sannox pays no mind to such nonsense." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And yet she sent you—" "She did not," Allerton confessed. "She expressly forbade me to contact you. She considers the matter closed, insists it was a draft or some accident of chimney construction. But I fear something darker, something terrible is afoot." Holmes stood abruptly and crossed to his bookshelf, pulling down a volume on structural anomalies in Georgian architecture. "You say the estate is near Haslemere? We'll take the 10:20 train from Waterloo." Allerton looked astonished. "You'll come, then?" "With all due haste." "Watson, pack your bag. We leave within the hour." As our guest departed, Holmes turned to me with that curious gleam in his eye, the one that always signaled the birth of a challenge worthy of his powers. "Watson, my friend," he said with quiet satisfaction, "we are about to investigate a fire that burns downward and leaves teeth in its wake. A most delightful contradiction. Let us see what logic makes of it." And thus, with fog curling at the window panes and the air full of smoke and secrets, we set out for Thistlebank Manor, to solve a crime that, at first glance, defied the very laws of nature. Chapter 2. The case begins. Holmes and Watson's first discussion. The 10:20 train from Waterloo had barely left the outskirts of London, when Holmes, who had been silent for most of the journey, finally stirred from his meditative posture by the window and spoke. "You see, Watson," he said, lacing his fingers together, "we are not merely investigating an architectural oddity or a village ghost story. What Mr. Allerton described suggests a deliberate staging, one that requires both ingenuity and nerve." "You believe the reversed fire was faked?" I asked. "Almost certainly. Nature does not reverse its course to entertain guests in a Surrey drawing-room. But the effect, if we take Allerton at his word, was so precise, so calculated in its horror, that I find myself admiring it already. Still," I replied, "it seems extraordinary to alter the direction of flame and smoke, to plant a human tooth in a lit fireplace without being seen. That stretches credibility, even for a clever trick." Holmes gave a small, satisfied smile, which is precisely what the perpetrator intends. An impossible crime draws attention away from plausible motives. No one expects the hand of man behind a phenomenon that defies physical law. He paused, then added with a touch of amusement, "You recall the matter of the vanishings in Norbury? Everyone suspected ghosts until we discovered the trapdoor beneath the parlor rug." "I do," I said, "but that had a tangible, mechanical explanation. Here, we're dealing with a live flame. How does one make it burn downward?" Holmes leaned back, his gaze distant. "We shall concern ourselves with the mechanics soon enough. For now, let us consider the context. Lady Cordelia Sannox, a name that once adorned the society pages, did it not?" "Yes," I said. "I believe she was widowed some 10 years ago. Her husband, Lord Percy Sannox, died under curious circumstances in Vienna." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "Curious, indeed. Poisoning, if I recall correctly. An investigation was opened, but conveniently abandoned for lack of jurisdiction. She returned to England shortly thereafter and vanished from public view. So she's no stranger to scandal precisely. And now she inherits an estate with a cursed fireplace and a history of death. Do you not find the symmetry appealing?" "I find it chilling," I said honestly. "Do you suspect her?" "I suspect someone wants us to look away from the obvious." Holmes tapped his knee. "Always be wary, Watson, when a thing appears designed to be inexplicable." As the train approached Haslemere, we descended into a wide valley where the morning mist still clung to the hedgerows. It was an overcast day, the kind where colors seem drained from the world, and Thistlebank Manor, as we approached it by hired trap, did little to dispel the sense of gloom. The house stood on a low rise, flanked by crooked oaks, its stone facade aged to a mottled gray. A pair of stags mounted above the entrance stared down with glassy eyes as we ascended the steps. We were received by a stiff-faced butler, who led us directly to a drawing-room so grand and somber it might have belonged. In a medieval castle, heavy tapestries hung along the walls, and in the center of it all stood the infamous fireplace. Tall, blackened with age, its iron grate still dusted with ash from the previous night. Mr. Allerton awaited us, joined now by a pale, angular young man in his early 30s, whom he introduced as Mr. Gideon Winstanley. Holmes took one glance at the young man and said, "You are left-handed, Mr. Winstanley, and recently spent time in Paris." Winstanley blinked in astonishment. Yes, but how on earth?" Holmes gestured to the man's cuff. "Your left sleeve is frayed in a manner consistent with a habitual writing motion, and the smudge of fine black dust on your lapel is from a Montmartre lithograph workshop. The chalk used there is distinctive." Winstanley turned to Allerton with a helpless expression. "I told you, he's some kind of magician." "Not magic," said Holmes, brushing past them, "merely observation." He stepped toward the fireplace and knelt with practiced ease. Watson and I watched in silence as he produced a small magnifying lens and peered into the grate. "The fire was built recently," he murmured. "3 logs slightly charred. But here, see this?" He pointed to a fragment of red wax nestled among the ashes. A candle, likely. Not part of any usual fire-making practice. Winstanley hesitated. "I had lit one last evening, just before the event." Holmes glanced at him sharply. "What color was the candle?" "Red." "It was?" "Sentimental. Belonged to my aunt. She burns them often." Holmes pocketed the wax scrap. "I shall require the remains of the candle and its holder, if you please." Allerton shifted nervously. "Holmes, forgive me, but do you believe this has something to do with witchcraft?" "I know how that sounds, but—" Holmes stood. "I believe it has something to do with illusion, Mr. Allerton. Illusion crafted with precision. Someone here, perhaps even within this household, has a gift for performance." At that moment, the door opened and a woman entered. She was tall, imperious, dressed in a deep burgundy gown with silver detailing. Her hair, streaked with gray, was drawn tightly back, exposing a face both aristocratic and utterly unreadable. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume," she said. Holmes bowed slightly. "Lady Cordelia Sannox, I presume. I had not summoned you." "No," said Holmes smoothly, "but your house did." A flicker of amusement passed across her face, followed by cold dismissal. "You'll find no demons here, Mr. Holmes, only drafts and foolish men with too much brandy in their systems." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and yet I intend to ask your permission to stay the night. It is not every day one encounters a fireplace that burns against the laws of combustion." Her expression tightened. "Very well," she said after a faint pause. "But you will find your answers lie in architecture, not murder." She swept from the room without a backward glance. Holmes watched her go. "An admirable performance," he said softly. "But I wonder, Watson, if the lady rehearses her dismissals in advance, or if deception comes that naturally to her." Chapter 3. The First Clues. A Scene of Deception. The peculiar chill in the drawing-room of Thistlebank Manor lingered long after Lady Sannox's departure, as if her presence had drawn the warmth from the space as effectively as the fire had been drawn into its hearth. Holmes remained near the fireplace, crouched like a cat about to pounce. Not on prey, but on truth. I could see the sharp focus in his eyes as he turned over ash, examined the fire brick, and sniffed faintly at the interior of the chimney mouth. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "even ashes tell tales, if one knows their language." He held out a pinch of gray residue between his fingers and let it fall onto his handkerchief. "Not just charred wood. There are traces of sulfur and something metallic. Do you notice the faint shimmer?" I peered closer. "Yes, almost like ground glass, or powdered magnesium, a theatrical compound, sometimes used to create an inverted flame effect on stage. Quite a thing to find in a country manor fireplace, wouldn't you say?" I nodded slowly. So the effect was produced deliberately. Undoubtedly. The real question is why, and of course, who. Holmes stood and scanned the room with a fresh gaze. The layout is worth noting. A single door bolted from the inside last night, according to Mr. Allerton, windows locked, heavy drapes drawn, and no one else entered the room, correct? "That is correct," said Allerton, who had resumed pacing along the perimeter of the drawing-room. "Just the two of us, Gideon and I." "And Lady Sennox?" "She had gone up to her chamber an hour before. She maintains strict routines. Since the accident in Vienna, she avoids anything that might be considered unorthodox." Holmes arched a brow. "Accident? I thought it was poisoning." Allerton's face stiffened. The official report was inconclusive. Holmes let the silence hang a moment too long, before turning his attention to the fireplace tools arranged neatly nearby. Poker, tongs, brush, and shovel. He lifted the shovel and examined its edge. "Curious," he murmured. "This shovel has been used recently, but only for ash. The poker, by contrast, is cold and untouched. And yet no fire is ever arranged without a poker being disturbed." I frowned. Could someone have staged the scene after the event? Holmes shook his head. That would suggest foresight, and quite a bit of it. "No, this feels more like a stage prepared before the performance." He moved to the tall mirror hanging above the mantel. It was gilded, cracked in one corner, and tilted ever so slightly downward, just enough to reflect the interior of the hearth when one stood before the fire. "Ah," Holmes said quietly, "here is something. What do you see?" He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he produced a small glass file from his coat and gently scraped along the lower right corner of the mirror's frame. The residue collected within was fine and gray, identical to that found in the grate. "I suspect," he said, "that this mirror played a part in the illusion. Some chemical agent, perhaps a compound ignited with heat or through chemical reaction, was used to produce the strange reversal. But mirrors are not innocent bystanders, Watson. They see more than we do, and sometimes they reveal what others wish to conceal." Just then, the door opened and a new figure entered. A short, balding man with a thick mustache, and the gait of a man who once knew military discipline, but had since grown comfortable with brandy and velvet slippers. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I am Dr. Cyril Fenimore. Lady Sennox asked me to make your acquaintance, though I confess I do so with reluctance." Holmes offered a polite nod. "We appreciate your candor, Doctor. I presume you were present at the manor last night." "I was, though not in the drawing-room. I had retired by 9. But you have knowledge of the household's peculiarities. I have served as Lady Sennox's physician since her return from the continent. The house has histories, but I have always attributed its stories to gas leaks, mold, and suggestible minds, Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You don't believe what Mr. Allerton saw." "I believe he believes it," Fenimore replied. "But I also believe gentlemen who imbibe brandy and stare too long into flickering fires are apt to see unnatural things." "And the tooth?" I asked. "Do you dismiss that as well?" Fenimore shrugged. "I haven't examined it. I understand it was taken upstairs for safekeeping. I can fetch it, if you wish." "Please do," Holmes said. "And may I ask, have you ever treated any injuries relating to the fireplace?" Fenimore's brow furrowed. "Not directly, though Miss Maud, Lady Sannox's maid, did once mention a footman burning himself years ago while trying to clean the flue. Claimed something knocked the brush back at him. I chalked it up to soot and superstition." "May we speak to this maid?" "She's away in Woking with family," said Allerton. "Took leave last week." Holmes's lips thinned. "Convenient timing," I murmured. Holmes nodded, then paced slowly to the far wall where a collection of antique weapons hung in careful arrangement. Spears, sabers, and a pair of flintlock pistols sat in carved brackets. He ran a finger along one musket, barrel, and sniffed. "Recently polished," he said, and reloaded. Allerton looked surprised. "They're for show. No one fires them." "Then someone is preparing for more than display," Holmes replied. The conversation was interrupted by the return of Dr. Fenimore, who now carried a small cotton-wrapped bundle. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal a human molar, yellowed, cracked, and unmistakably old. Holmes took it with gloved hands, studied it for several moments under his lens, and frowned. "What is it?" I asked. "Two things," he said. "First, this tooth did not belong to a living man. At least not. Recently, there is no trace of blood or soft tissue. It has been extracted, cleaned, and stored for some time. And second, Holmes held up the tooth so that it caught the light. There is a fine groove carved around the base, artificial, almost ceremonial." He looked up, expression grave. This was planted deliberately, and not just as a grotesque prop. "No, Watson, someone is making a statement. The question is, to whom?" Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. That evening, Thistlebank Manor was quieter than one might expect for a house now at the center of a most peculiar investigation. A subdued tension hung over the dining table as Holmes and I joined the household for supper. An atmosphere stiffened by the absence of casual conversation, and the rustling unease that moved from guest to guest like a cold current. Lady Cordelia, Sannox, sat at the head of the table, dressed in a gown of midnight blue, her silver necklace glinting with every precise movement. Beside her sat Dr. Cyril Fenimore, whose round spectacles fogged faintly as he spooned his soup. Across from me was Gideon Winstanley, the sharp-featured nephew who seemed to carry a perennial look of disbelief. At the far end, staring intently at Holmes, was a young woman I had not yet met, Miss Adela Rowntree. She had the look of someone who did not belong to the room, but had long resigned herself to its company. Her hands trembled occasionally as she cut into her food, and she avoided the gaze of both Lady Sannox and Mr. Winstanley. Her dress, though elegant, bore signs of recent wear. Frayed stitching near the sleeves, a barely concealed patch on the collar. "I don't believe we've been introduced," I ventured gently. She looked up, startled, then offered a timid smile. "Adela Rowntree, I'm Lady Sannox's companion." Holmes, who had said nothing since being seated, finally stirred. "And how long have you held that position, Miss Rowntree?" 2 years, she replied, her voice steadying. "Since, returning from Italy, my lady required someone for correspondence and music. I play the piano. Do you recall hearing anything unusual the night of the fire incident?" She hesitated. There was a sound, like a cough from the chimney. But I dismissed it. I thought it might be the wind. I was in my room upstairs. "And were you alone?" Holmes asked, his tone polite but unyielding. She flinched just slightly. "Yes, quite alone." Lady Sannox, who had been silently observing the exchange, now laid down her fork. "Miss Rowntree's time is not under investigation, Mr. Holmes. I have known her character better than any present, and she would have—" "No cause to be near the drawing-room," Holmes inclined his head. "I did not mean to suggest otherwise. But as you no doubt know, Lady Sannox, truth hides in corners, often behind the most ordinary habits." Lady Sannox did not reply. Instead, she dabbed her lips with her napkin and stood. "I believe we are finished here. Mr. Holmes, if you require further assistance, you may speak to Mr. Allerton. Good night." She swept from the room with her usual theatrical precision, and a moment later, Infinimore rose as well, muttering something about medical journals and the need to retire early. That left Holmes, myself, Gideon Winstanley, and Miss Rowantree at the table. Winstanley downed the last of his brandy and gave Holmes a rather withering look. "You think one of us staged it, don't you? That the entire affair is some charade meant to frighten the household?" Holmes tapped his fingers together. "What I believe, Mr. Winstanley, is that someone wishes to create fear, not merely to frighten, but to control. And fear, as you may have noticed, is most effective when wrapped in spectacle." "And who benefits from such fear?" I asked Holmes, looked at Gideon. "That is precisely the question." Winstanley stood abruptly. "I don't appreciate the implication." "No implication," Holmes said calmly. "Only deduction." After Winstanley stormed out, Miss Rowantree lingered, her fingers nervously tugging at embroidered hem of her sleeve. Holmes regarded her in silence for a moment, then said softly, "You noticed something that night, Miss Rowantree. Something you've not told anyone." She froze. "I didn't think it mattered. I wasn't even sure I saw it properly." "Nevertheless, you did see something." Her shoulders sagged. "Yes, a light in the hallway. Just a flicker through the keyhole. I assumed it was Gideon coming from the study. But now, I'm not certain." "What time?" "Just after the fire incident, I heard Mr. Allerton calling out, and the light vanished." Holmes nodded gravely. "Thank you, Miss Rowntree. That is helpful." She rose and excused herself, leaving Holmes and me alone at the table. "Well," I asked, "a light in the corridor. Does it tell us anything?" "It suggests movement," Holmes said, "and perhaps panic. Whoever caused the phenomenon did not linger to admire their handiwork." He stood and beckoned me to follow. We returned to the drawing-room, now dim and quiet. Holmes moved to the fireplace and stood silently before it. Then, without warning, he stepped onto the hearth and reached his hand into the chimney's throat. "Holmes," I cried, "what are you doing?" He ignored me, instead removing something with great care, a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a silver pendant, intricately wrought, with a strange sigil carved into its center. It hung from a blackened chain, as if it had been subjected to great heat. "A religious icon?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No religion I've seen. More likely a charm, superstitious trinket designed to unsettle. But who placed it there? That, Watson, is what we must discover. But mark my words, whoever left this expected it to be destroyed by the flames. Its survival is either an oversight or a message. I studied the pendant's design. What does it mean?" "I cannot say," Holmes replied. "Not yet. But someone in this house carries knowledge of ancient fears and knows how to use them. and now we must begin drawing them into the light. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The red herring, the morning after our unsettling supper, was damp and cold. Mist clung to the hedgerows, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet leaves and old stone. Holmes had risen before I, as usual, and I found him pacing the gravel drive when I came down shortly after breakfast. He was deep in thought, hands behind his back, head bowed as if the gravel itself might offer some revelation. "You sit poorly," I observed. "Rest eludes the mind that dances," he replied. "But no matter. We have our first suspect, and I intend to press gently against the illusion to see where it gives." "Who do you mean? Winstanley?" Holmes nodded. A man of pride, resentment, and carefully veiled desperation. "There is something brittle in him, Watson, a veneer of sophistication covering a deeper fracture." We did not need to wait long for an opportunity. Gideon Winstanley was in the breakfast room, seated with a newspaper and nursing a second cup of strong tea. When we entered, he did not rise, but acknowledged us with a wary glance. "I suppose you're here to ask more questions," he muttered. "On the contrary," Holmes said with cheer, "I came to offer you an apology." That caught him off guard. Apology? For what? For what I allowed to pass as an insinuation last night. "It was quite improper of me. I suspect that you are a man wrongfully caught in the shadows of this house." Gideon narrowed his eyes. "Is this some trick?" "No trick. I only hoped you might help me understand something. It seems there are financial strains at Thistlebank, and you, being in charge of certain estate affairs, must have insight." Winstanley's jaw tightened. "I manage the estate, yes. My aunt insists on retaining ownership, but the house bleeds money. Land taxes, repairs, dwindling tenants, it's all crumbling. Is Lady Sannox unaware?" "She is willfully ignorant. She insists the Sannox name must remain attached to Thistlebank, regardless of cost. But the truth is, we can't afford to heat the West Wing." Holmes leaned forward. "Would you stand to gain anything if she were to relinquish control?" Winstanley stiffened. "If you're asking whether I wish her harm, then the answer is no. But if she were to accept the need to sell, or move permanently to the London residence, yes, I'd be relieved." Holmes nodded as if satisfied. "And the drawing-room fireplace, when was it last inspected?" "Not in my memory," Winstanley said. "It's ancient. We've had issues with the flue, but nothing like what happened 2 nights ago." "Could someone have accessed it from the rear?" "Not unless they crawled through 2 feet of brickwork." "There's no second entrance." Holmes stood. "Thank you. Your candor is appreciated. One last question. Where were you between 8:45 and 9:15 that evening?" "In the study, going over accounts. Edward Allerton will confirm it. I came in just before we went to the drawing-room." Holmes offered a courteous nod and left the room. I followed him into the corridor, where he paused beneath the mounted stags and lit a cigarette with one of the long matches he kept in a silver case. "He's not lying," I said. "No, he isn't." "But that doesn't make him innocent," Holmes replied. "It only means his truth is selective." "Then, do you still suspect him?" "I suspect he's being used, or perhaps trying to shield someone." Before I could ask more, the butler approached. "Us. Pardon, gentlemen. Miss Rowantree has requested a moment of your time. She's in the library." We found her seated near the window, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the morning mist outside. She stood when we entered her, posture strained by nerves. "Mr. Holmes," she began, "I didn't say everything I should have yesterday." Holmes took a seat beside her, his expression gently encouraging. "I told you I saw a light in the hall." "That's true, but I also saw a shadow. A figure, just for a moment." Could you tell who it was? No, it was too fast. But it moved. Oddly. As though whoever it was didn't want to be heard. Holmes tilted his head. That's very specific, Miss Rowntree. I've lived here long enough to know the difference between someone walking naturally and someone creeping. This person was trying to move without alerting anyone. Did you hear footsteps? No. That's what struck me. I saw the shape, but I heard nothing. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Do you know if the servants were all accounted for? There were only 2 present that night, Mrs. Embry, the cook, and Oswald, the footman. Oswald retires early and rarely leaves the kitchen level after supper. Would you trust them? She hesitated. I would trust Mrs. Embry. Oswald is odd, quiet, but not in a harmless way. Holmes stood. I should like to speak to him. We found Oswald polishing silver in the butler's pantry. His thin frame hunched over like a spider over its web. He spoke in clipped answers, offering no more than what was required. Where were you the night of the fire incident? Holmes asked. In my room, below the kitchen. Did you hear anything? No. Did you see anyone pass through the servants' hall? No. Holmes observed him silently for a moment before gesturing to the row of keys hanging neatly on hooks by the pantry door. Are these to the main rooms? Yes, sir. Holmes plucked one labeled drawing room. This key, when was it last used? Oswald blinked. I clean the drawing room on Wednesdays. That's the last time I unlocked it. And you relock it afterward? Yes. Holmes returned the key and offered no further comment. As we walked away, I whispered, Do you think he was the one in the corridor? Holmes shook his head. No. Oswald is dull, but not capable of artifice. Someone else borrowed that key, or had their own. As we stepped back into the main hall, Holmes stopped abruptly. We are being misdirected, Watson. Toward Winstanley? Yes. Everything about this setup, his motives, his proximity, even his arguments, are too neat. When things arrange themselves so conveniently, I begin to doubt their authenticity. Then who? That, Holmes said quietly, is what we must now determine. The real player hides behind the noise, and they are watching every step we take. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. It was not long after our interview with the reticent footman that Holmes asked me to accompany him on a short walk around the estate grounds. The sky had brightened slightly, though a pallid gray still pressed down over the manor like a shroud. We followed a winding stone path that led behind the house, where the remnants of an overgrown rose garden stood entangled with frost-bitten ivy. Holmes was unusually silent for several minutes, his eyes fixed not on the ground, but on the windows and angles of the house. I recognized the expression, one of deep internal calculation, as though his mind was building some invisible geometry of facts in the air. You noted it, of course, he said abruptly. I noted many things, I replied cautiously. Which, in particular, do you mean? He stopped beside a crumbling sundial and pointed to the upper floors of the west wing. That window, the one just above the drawing room. Did you observe it last night? Only in passing. It was shuttered, I believe. It was not, Holmes said. It was ajar, by a crack no wider than 2 fingers. This morning, it is fastened tight and latched from the inside. Curious, wouldn't you say? Perhaps a draft, I suggested, though I knew better than to expect Holmes to accept such an explanation. Or perhaps an exit, he said, one not accounted for in the locked-room narrative we've been fed. I frowned. But from the drawing room to that window, there's no stair, no ladder. That section of the house is a solid drop. Quite, which is why I am intrigued. Either someone possesses a talent for climbing masonry, or the events occurred in a different order than reported. We continued walking until we reached a cluster of trees at the edge of the rear lawn, where Holmes crouched near a drainage trench. He brushed aside some fallen leaves and retrieved a broken sliver of red wax, the same hue as the residue he had found in the fireplace. He held it up to the light. "This confirms my suspicion." "The candle?" "Yes, but more importantly, where the wax is found. This fragment was discarded outside, nowhere near the hearth. That means a candle was lit elsewhere and transported or deliberately hidden here afterward." I stared at the shard. Then the ritual, or whatever spectacle was staged, began out here, possibly. Or the candle was never meant for the fireplace at all. Holmes rose, pocketing the fragment. "Let us test a theory." We returned to the manor through the servants' entrance and made our way back to the drawing room. Holmes moved to the fireplace and again inspected the iron grate, this time focusing on the back wall. With his cane, he gently prodded a darkened panel of firebrick near the base. There was a faint click, and a narrow plate loosened just enough to betray its concealment. Inside was astonishing. A small phial sealed, with wax, its contents cloudy and pale blue. Holmes exhaled sharply. "There it is? What is it?" I asked, leaning in. He examined it under his lens. A compound of sulfate, and perhaps oil of vitriol. Not dangerous in this quantity, but volatile enough when heated. It would create a reverse draft effect. Drawing, flame downward, altering the flow of air, distorting the perception of the fire. Then it was a chemical illusion. Yes, brilliantly executed and placed long before the night in question. That niche is old. It was used for smuggling or hiding valuables in another century. Someone rediscovered it and repurposed it to produce their ghost story. I felt a chill pass through me. But why? To frighten Lady Sannox? To force her hand in something? "Not Lady Sannox," Holmes murmured. "She did not witness it." The targets were Allerton and Winstanley, both of whom occupy positions of trust and proximity to the estate's management. "You think someone is trying to manipulate the household? Or unsettle it? Destabilize it even?" Just then, footsteps approached. It was Allerton, his expression troubled. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "There's something you should know, though it may seem trivial." "Nothing is trivial," Holmes replied. "Please." Allerton hesitated, then spoke. "The morning after the incident, I noticed a discrepancy in the guest ledger. Miss Rowentree's signature was entered twice, once the day she arrived last. Week, and again 2 nights ago. But she hasn't left." "Are you quite certain?" Holmes asked. "Yes, I checked the ink. The second entry is fresh, barely dry when I found it." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, then turned back to Allerton. "Show us." We followed him to a small side parlor where the guest book was kept inside a walnut cabinet. Allerton opened it to a page dated 5 days prior. 2 neat signatures in the same hand were listed. Adela Rowantree. One signed upon arrival. The second, oddly, written beneath it in darker ink. Holmes traced the second signature lightly with his gloved finger. She forged her own name twice. "But why?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flipped to the previous page, and then to the next, his eyes darting across entries. Then he stopped, tapped once on the page, and nodded. "Because someone else's name had been removed. See here. Between entries dated 3 and 5 days ago, there is a faint indentation. Someone tore out a leaf." Allerton blanched. "I hadn't noticed." "She was covering for someone," Holmes said softly, "or protecting them. someone who arrived and left again, unrecorded. And that person is almost certainly involved in what occurred in the drawing room. A silence fell over the room, heavy with implication. Then who was it? I asked. Holmes straightened. That, Watson, is what we must determine. And quickly. Whoever staged the false miracle did not do so to entertain. They are setting the stage for something larger. As we left the parlor, Holmes paused and looked once more toward the upper window, now tightly shuttered. The backward-burning fireplace was only the beginning. The true performance has yet to begin. Chapter 7: The Crime Grows Stranger. The fog returned with renewed vengeance that evening, rolling over the hills like a slow, suffocating tide. By twilight, the grounds of Thistlebank Manor had vanished, behind a wall of silvery haze, and even the gas lamps along the main hallways flickered with unease. It was then, as shadows deepened and the wind howled faintly around the gables, that the second and altogether more troubling event took place. Holmes and I were in the study, poring over the guest book and the torn remnant of the missing page, when Allerton burst in without knocking. His face, already pale, was ghostly in the dim light. "She's gone!" he cried. "Adela! Miss Rowantree! Her room is empty. The window's open, and the bed hasn't been slept in." Holmes was on his feet instantly. "When was she last seen?" "After dinner, around 8, I believe. She said she had a headache and retired early. No one's seen her since." Holmes grabbed his coat and strode swiftly down the corridor. "Watson, fetch your revolver. What do you think has happened?" "I don't know, but I fear Miss Rowantree has stepped into the heart of the illusion, or perhaps was pulled into it by the time we reached her room on the second floor. Lady Sannox, Winstanley, and Dr. Fenimore had already gathered. The scene was as Allerton had described. The window flung wide, curtains drifting in the cold night air, and a small travel case missing from the corner." Holmes examined the sill closely. "No footprints," he murmured, "nor scuffs. She didn't climb down. And yet—" He leaned out, eyes scanning the narrow path that circled the house. Then he turned to the vanity. "Table, her handbag is still here, and so is her coat. No woman flees into the night without either, especially in this chill." Lady Sannox spoke, her voice low and hard. "She is an impressionable girl. This foolish talk of hauntings and phantom fires has clearly overwhelmed her. I warned her not to get involved." Holmes raised a brow. "And yet she was involved deeply. In fact, I believe she knew more than she intended to share. Perhaps too much." Fenimore shook his head. "If she's left the house, we must notify the constables." "No," Holmes said sharply. "Not yet. That would only scatter the players. We need them in place." He turned to Winstanley. "Is there a cellar?" "Yes, beneath the west wing, but it hasn't been used in years." "Then we shall use it now," Holmes said grimly. With lanterns in hand, we descended a narrow stairwell behind the butler's pantry, and entered the vast, musty expanse of the cellar. The air was cold, thick with the scent of mildew, and something older, earthier. Crates were stacked in the corners, covered in sheets, and long-forgotten furniture lay wrapped in canvas. "Over there," Holmes said suddenly, pointing. In a recess beneath the stair arch, a door sat slightly ajar. Holmes approached cautiously, lantern raised. Inside was a narrow chamber, no larger than a storage closet, and at first it appeared empty. But as the light moved, I saw the unmistakable outline of a human figure curled against the stone wall. "Adela!" I rushed in. She was breathing barely, her skin deathly pale and her dress torn at the sleeve. A faint bruise was forming on her forehead. Holmes crouched beside her and examined the wound. A blow, glancing not deep, she was struck and hidden here. But by whom? I asked, heart racing. Holmes glanced at the floor. No drag marks. She was led here, or brought swiftly and carefully. Adela stirred, her voice a hoarse whisper. He was wearing gloves. Who, Miss Rowntree? Holmes asked gently. Who did this to you? But her head lolled, and she fell unconscious again. We carried her to her room, where Fenimore began tending to her with quiet efficiency. Holmes stood at the foot of the bed, his jaw clenched, eyes alight with controlled fury. This changes the complexion of the crime entirely, he said. It is no longer illusion or threat. It is action. Do you think she was silenced? I asked. Holmes nodded. Or nearly so, and not because of superstition or games. Miss Rowntree knew the name that had been torn from the guest book. I am convinced of it. Allerton appeared in the doorway. What do we do now? Holmes turned to him. We let everyone believe she is resting. No panic, no alarm. Let the perpetrator believe they have succeeded. Tonight we set the stage for a far greater trick, one that will end with unmasking. After the room was cleared, I found Holmes in the drawing room again, gazing at the hearth. You said the fireplace was the beginning? I reminded him. What follows next? He smiled faintly. A second act. The attacker believes they... Hold the script. We must now rewrite it, Watson, without them knowing it. He stooped and pulled a small black object from the folds of his coat. It was the silver pendant he had earlier discovered hidden in the chimney. This symbol, he said, is not merely decorative. It is a cipher, a language, a threat in disguise. I've traced it before, in a case in Bavaria. It was once used to indicate complicity in secret societies. Not true ones, mind you, but invented cults used to terrorize gullible households. A con, nothing more. Then the entire haunting is a smokescreen, precisely, a beautiful one. But with Adela's attack, the charade has escalated into violence. And when a man escalates his deception into brutality, he's preparing to either flee or finish his design. Holmes turned from the hearth and looked at me with clear, solemn purpose. Tonight, Watson, we bait a trap. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The fog held fast over Thistlebank as night returned, thicker than ever now, clinging to the windows like smeared grease and muffling all sound. Within the manor, gaslights burned low, casting long shadows that twisted over the carved paneling and stone hearths. Holmes had taken complete control of the evening, and for once no one dared challenge him. By 9 o'clock, the household was scattered across their quarters by Holmes's instruction. Miss Rowntree, now under sedation in her bed, was guarded by Allerton in an adjoining room. Dr. Fenimore had been asked to remain in the library with Lady Sannox, both unaware that they too were being observed. As for Winstanley, Holmes had dispatched him on an invented errand to the village chemist, ensuring the nephew would be absent at a crucial hour. That left Holmes, myself, and a single footman, Oswald, stationed strategically throughout the lower floor. Holmes stood alone in the drawing-room, the room where it had all begun, and waited for the final act to unfold. But it was not Holmes's style to sit idly. As the clock struck 10, he moved deliberately through the room, adjusting the mirror above the fireplace by a mere inch, shifting the heavy curtains to allow a blade of moonlight to pierce the gloom, and laying a folded sheet of parchment atop the mantel. It bore nothing but a symbol, the same sigil found on the pendant, drawn in thick, black ink with a deliberate hand. "What are you hoping to provoke?" I asked in a whisper from the adjacent corridor, where I watched unseen. "A reaction," Holmes said without turning. "Some men fear ghosts, others fear exposure. Our adversary fears both, but more so he fears discovery." There was a faint sound, and the floorboards creaking ever so slightly from the hall beyond. Holmes didn't move. He took a seat near the hearth and reached for his violin. The low strains of a Hungarian dirge floated through the air, slow and haunting. Then came a second sound. A door latch gently clicked. Holmes stopped playing. "Ah," he murmured, right on cue. From my vantage point, I saw the drawing-room door swing inward. A figure stood in the threshold, draped in a long black cloak, gloved and hooded. Even in shadow, the bearing was unmistakably male, rigid, controlled as though acting on a rehearsed script. The figure stepped forward, and Holmes spoke with perfect calm. "It's a poor habit, donning theatrical robes for criminal enterprise. You'd have done better to study chemistry instead." The man froze. "I don't know what you mean." "But you do," Holmes said, rising. "You tampered with the fireplace, planted a false relic, and staged the reversal of flame. You forged guest records, struck an unconscious girl, and concealed your presence in this house under a name that has already been erased from the book." The voice behind the hood trembled. "You have no proof." Holmes smiled. "Not yet, but you're about to give it to me." With a swift motion, Holmes reached toward the folded parchment on the mantel and flung it into the fire. There was a sudden flash, a chemical spark, and the room was momentarily illuminated by a pale blue flame that crackled unnaturally. The figure staggered backward, startled. In the confusion, Holmes lunged and pulled away the hood. It was Dr. Cyril Fenimore. I burst into the room as the others, startled by the commotion, began to rush down the corridor. Allerton was the first to arrive. Then Winstanley, out of breath from his forced errand. Lady Sennox followed moments later, wrapped in a silk robe and wide-eyed. "Dr. Fenimore," she exclaimed, "what is the meaning of this?" Holmes did not answer her directly. Instead, he addressed the doctor, who stood motionless, the mask of gentlemanly poise now fully shattered. "Tell them," Holmes said quietly, "tell them why you did it." Fenimore's shoulders rose and fell once, and then he spoke, his voice flat and stripped of artifice. "She found the page," he said. "Adela!" She realized I'd been here before, years ago, under a different name. I tore the page out, but she noticed the ink marks, saw that I'd covered someone else's name by duplicating her own. "Clever girl." Lady Sennox stepped back. "You, what are you talking about?" "Percy," Fenimore said. "Your husband. You thought he died in Vienna by accident, but he didn't. He was poisoned by me." The silence in the room grew deafening. "You were in love with her," Holmes said softly. Fenimore laughed bitterly. "I was obsessed. She never returned it. Not then, not after Percy died, not even when she brought me here to treat her nerves. So you turned to fear. Yes, I knew about the passage behind the fireplace, the old trick with the magnesium compound, an illusion for country folk and gullible servants. I used it to create panic, to drive Winstanley away, to frighten Adela into silence, to control the house. I wanted Cordelia to lean on me, to need me." Lady Sennox said nothing. Her expression, rigid as stone, betrayed no emotion. Holmes approached Fenimore and looked him squarely in the eyes. "And when Adela grew suspicious, when she realized what you'd done, you struck her and hid her away." Fenimore didn't deny it. "I never meant to hurt her, just stop her." Holmes gestured toward Allerton, who stepped forward and removed a small pair of shackles from a cabinet drawer. An item Holmes had earlier requested be kept on hand. Fenimore did not resist as they were fitted over his wrists. As the doctor was led away, Holmes turned to the room. "The flame burned downward," he said softly, "because it was meant to distract you from the man who was sinking deeper into his own darkness, and with that, the curtain fell on the illusion, and the truth stepped fully into the light." Chapter 9. A Second Attempt. The Culprit Strikes Again. The revelation of Dr. Cyril Fenimore's guilt was, in many respects, a relief to the household. Lady Sannox did not speak of him again, though her face during the confession had been unreadable, stiff with the dignity of someone too proud to admit fear, and perhaps too weary to feel betrayal. Gideon Winstanley resumed his usual pacing along the corridor walls. Allerton returned to his duties with a grim resolve, and Holmes, for his part, remained unusually silent the following morning. Yet I knew better than to mistake that silence for satisfaction. We were in the small reading room by the east window, where Holmes sat absently toying with a glass vial, its liquid contents catching the sunlight. The morning paper, untouched on the side table, carried no mention of the events that had transpired at Thistlebank. The story remained contained for now. "I can see it in your eyes," I said. "You're not convinced it's over." Holmes looked up, faintly amused. "No, Watson, I am not." But Fenimore confessed, yes, and truthfully, in part. He tampered with the fireplace, he planted the pendant, he struck Miss Rowantree. All of that aligns, but the question remains, why now? "You mean his motivation?" "No, I mean the timing." Holmes stood, pacing. "Fenimore has known Lady Sannox for years. His obsession did not bloom last week. The passage behind the hearth, he would have known about it long before. And the chemical compounds, the backward flame, the elaborate scene, that took planning, careful, meticulous planning." He stopped by the mantel and drummed his fingers, and yet it all erupted within a span of days, as if something forced his hand. Something or someone pressed the matter to move faster than he wished. A knock came at the door. Allerton stepped in, his face drawn. "I hate to interrupt, Mr. Holmes, but the inspector from Haslemere has arrived to escort Fenimore. I thought you'd wish to be present." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and the rest of the household. Lady Sannox remains in her chamber. When Stanley is in the stables, Miss Rowantree is still resting. Fenimore is locked in the cellar office under Oswald's guard." Holmes and I followed Allerton down the narrow stone corridor that led beneath, the manor where a converted wine-room had been transformed into a holding chamber of sorts. But as we approached, something struck me instantly. Silence. No shuffling, no voices, no coughs. The sort of silence that precedes revelation, or calamity. Oswald stood rigid by the door. When he saw us, his face drained of color. "He's gone," he said. Holmes pushed past him, flung open the door, and stepped inside. The room was empty. The lantern still flickered low on the desk. The chair Fenimore had occupied was tipped backward. The window, small and barred, remained shut. But the key to the inner door lay on the floor. "How long since you last checked?" Holmes asked Oswald sharply. "Not 5 minutes, he was. In there when I brought him water. I locked the door myself. I swear it, sir." Holmes examined the desk, then the door frame. "He did not escape alone," he said. "The lock was not picked. The key was taken. Someone let him out." "But who?" I asked. Holmes glanced toward the stairs. "That is what we must learn. Quickly." We made for the main floor, but before we had crossed the entry hall, a shriek rang through the air, sharp, feminine and unmistakable, a terrified. We sprinted up the grand staircase to the west wing where Miss Rowentree's room stood open. She was standing just beyond the threshold, clutching the bedpost with white knuckles, her face sheet white. He was here? He gasped. In my room. Holmes steadied her. Fenimore, she nodded, eyes wide. I awoke to find him standing beside the bed. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, then fled out the door. Holmes turned immediately. Come, Watson. We raced down the hallway. No one passed us, but Holmes stopped midway along the corridor and turned sharply toward the tapestry that hung at the far end. Help me with this, he said. We pulled the tapestry aside, revealing a hidden door, low and narrow, set flush into the wall. A second servant's passage, Holmes muttered. He threw it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air inside was still, far too still. We descended with caution, lanterns high, each step groaning under our weight. The passage curved and then split. Holmes paused, sniffed the air, and pointed left. I can smell sulfur, he said. We followed the path, which opened into a small alcove beneath the drawing room. There, amid scattered crates and forgotten tools, lay Fenimore. Face down, Holmes knelt and rolled him over gently. His eyes were open, frozen in terror, and a jagged wound bled from just below the chin. A blade lay beside him. An old hunting knife, its ivory handle cracked with age. Dead, Holmes said quietly, but not by his own hand. Then someone killed him. Holmes stood slowly. Yes, Watson, our story has shifted again. Fenimore was the engineer of illusion, but someone else feared what he might say now that the game was unraveling. But who? I whispered. And how did they know where he was? Holmes turned, eyes dark with insight, because they were watching all along and perhaps guiding him. He gazed up at the low ceiling of the tunnel and whispered almost to himself, the fire burned backward, but the crime now burns forward, with purpose. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The death of Dr. Fenimore shifted the axis of the investigation. What had begun as an illusion crafted by a desperate man now revealed itself to be a far more intricate operation, one involving multiple hands, concealed relationships, and a guiding intelligence far colder than Fenimore's, fevered obsession. Inspector Raleigh of the Haslemere Constabulary arrived by noon, a stocky man with sharp eyes and a clipped mustache. He listened in grim silence as Holmes laid out the known facts. When Raleigh finally spoke, it was with a reluctant respect. So, you're saying Fenimore orchestrated the backwards fire, attacked the girl, and then someone else, unknown, freed him, only to kill him once he became a liability? Precisely, Holmes said. And if you seek motive, Inspector, it lies not in Fenimore's madness, but in what he may have known. The constable scratched his chin. So who had something to lose by Fenimore talking? Holmes turned toward the window, where the AI sun struggled to pierce the gloom. That, Inspector, is the question we must now answer with speed and precision, because the true architect of this scheme is still within this house, and they are watching our every move. It was shortly after Raleigh left to report to his superiors that Holmes gathered me in the study once more. His energy had returned, sharper than ever. He paced in tight circles before the fire, pausing only to scribble something in a small leather notebook, before tearing out the page and placing it carefully in his coat pocket. "Watson," he said, Everything we have been shown is a performance, a deception that mimics chaos while hiding a brutal logic. The reversed fire, the staged relic, the forged guest book, even the assault on Miss Rowantree. Each was a step designed to unsettle and distract. But Fenimore did not act alone. He was a tool, a brilliant, unstable one, but still a tool. And the hand behind him, I asked. Holmes's brow furrowed. Let us consider the victim. Fenimore's guilt was useful. It gave someone the perfect scapegoat. But once he was caught, once he became a liability, he was removed. I nodded slowly. Eliminated before he could reveal his benefactor. Just so. And now we must ask, what does this benefactor truly want? He turned abruptly and pulled a large sheet of parchment from the drawer, laying it across the desk. It was a rough blueprint of Thistlebank Manor's original architecture, which Holmes had requested earlier that morning from the county archives. He pointed to a wing of the house that had remained largely unexplored. The old servant quarters walled off during renovations in 1887 there, Holmes said. The sealed hall. Fenimore knew about the tunnel beneath the drawing room. He used it. But someone else has continued using parts of the house long believed forgotten. And if I'm correct, that wing connects to a second exit, one leading to the gamekeeper's cottage in the woods. An escape route or a smuggling path, used now for private movement. He looked at me squarely. I intend to enter that wing tonight. Alone, if necessary. But I'll need your help with something first. At Holmes's instruction, I returned to Miss Rowantree's chamber and requested a brief word. She was pale, wrapped in a shawl by the window, but more lucid than she had been since the attack. The fear had not left her eyes, but behind it now burned a quiet resolve. Miss Rowantree, I said gently, Holmes believes you may recall something else. Something small, perhaps overlooked. Something that might help identify the man behind all this. She hesitated, then spoke in a halting whisper. There was a book, in the library. I saw Dr. Fenimore with it before all this began. It wasn't one of Lady Sannox's usual volumes. I thought it odd at the time. Leather-bound red spine, strange symbols on the cover. He tucked it away behind the travel atlases. I relayed this at once to Holmes, who sprang into action. Within minutes, we were in the library, pulling books from the upper shelves until Holmes gave a quiet grunt of triumph. He held up the volume, a heavy dark red tome marked with a faded gold sigil, Codex Nocturne, an index of secret societies, symbols, and ceremonial devices. A rare book, Holmes said, opening it with care. Banned in several countries. A compendium of nonsense for the most part, but occasionally a useful tool for those who wish to manipulate the fearful. He turned to a dog-eared page. Here, he murmured, the same sigil we found on the pendant, and again on the parchment I burned. And its meaning? I asked. He read aloud. The Mark of Vultus, a false society invented in 1783 by confidence tricksters in Prussia. Used to intimidate merchants, stage false rites, and extract loyalty through fear. Favored symbols, the backward flame, the hidden key, the tongue of silence. I felt a chill pass through me. The tongue of silence. Exactly. The missing page from the guest book. Fenimore's silencing. Everything connects. This was not about ghosts, Watson. It was about power. He closed the book sharply. And someone here resurrected this performance from the dust of forgotten theater, using Fenimore as both actor and pawn. Tonight, I intend to find out who. At midnight, Holmes prepared to enter the sealed servant wing. He carried only his lantern, a length of cord, a bottle of chalk dust, and the small revolver he rarely used. Before leaving, he handed me a sealed envelope. If I do not return by 2 o'clock, deliver this to Inspector Raleigh. Holmes, I do not anticipate danger, but I expect misdirection. That is always more perilous. And with that, he disappeared through the narrow passage beneath the stairs. The one he believed would lead into the forgotten wing. I stood for some time alone in the drawing room, the envelope cold in my hand. The house was silent. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, burning this time in the correct direction. But somewhere beyond the walls, in the dark hollows of Thistlebank, the true mind behind the illusion waited, and Holmes was walking straight into its den. Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes' Grand Strategy. The hour crept past 1 o'clock, and still there was no sign of Holmes. I remained by the drawing-room hearth, the sealed envelope heavy in my coat pocket, and my thoughts spiraling into darker territories with each passing minute. Outside, the fog clung to the manor's windows like frost, and though the fire warmed the room, I could not shake the sense that something ancient and patient was watching from the walls. Then, at precisely 20 minutes past 1, I heard a sound. A soft knock at the main door. Not a frantic pounding, but a deliberate rhythm. 3 short taps, a pause, then 2 more. I stood, uncertain. Surely Holmes would not return this way. A second knock, identical, came again. This time I crossed the threshold and opened the door cautiously, keeping one hand near the pistol in my waistband. It was Holmes, but not as I expected him. His coat was dusted with soot, his eyes sharp, and in one hand he carried an object wrapped in black oilcloth. "You're late," I said, stepping aside. I nearly tore open that envelope. "And you would have found it disappointingly cryptic," he replied, "but now you shall have the true ending, Watson, and not the precautionary one." He moved to the hearth and tossed the oilcloth bundle onto a side table, where it landed with a soft metallic thud. Unwrapping it, he revealed a brass lantern, several lengths of old wire, and, most remarkably, a velvet pouch filled with silver. Tokens, each engraved with the mark of Vultus. "This," he said, holding one token between his fingers, "is the currency of deception." He poured the rest of the pouch onto the table. I found them behind a false panel in the sealed west wing, along with ledgers, letters, and a partial map of the estate with coded annotations. "And whose name was on the letters?" I asked. Holmes gave a small, grim smile. "Ah, Watson, now you reach the heart of the game, but first you must understand the move I've made." He drew 2 chairs near the fire and sat, gesturing for me to do the same. Then he began calmly, precisely. Fenimore was the performance, the visible sleight of hand. But he was never the magician. Someone encouraged his madness, supplied him with the means to execute his dramatic illusions, and ensured he would be caught at the right moment. But, when Fenimore's capture became inconvenient, the magician struck the match again, and this time snuffed him out completely. Holmes took a breath. I had to lure the real culprit into thinking the game was done, that the scapegoat had taken the fall. So I spread 2 falsehoods, one that the pendant had been destroyed in the fire, 2 that the book, the Codex Nocturne, was still hidden in the manor, locked away in Miss Rowntree's room. I frowned. Why her room? Because the attacker already had reason to fear her. And fear, when focused, makes people reckless. Sat forward. You were hoping the true mastermind would attempt another move. Holmes nodded. Yes, and while I explored the sealed wing, I left a snare in the baited chamber. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small photographic plate. This was hidden behind Miss Rowntree's mirror, a camera fixed on the room since sunset. It captured anyone who entered under cover of darkness. He held up the plate toward the firelight. Even in the dim reflection, I could see the image beginning to take shape. A figure, mid-step, gloved, stooped over a drawer. "Who is it?" I whispered. Holmes stood. "Come, I believe it's time for a final conversation." Lady Sennox was seated in her private parlor when we arrived. She had returned to her regal bearing, draped in fine silk, her eyes sharp but expressionless. She did not seem surprised to see Holmes enter unannounced. "I take it you've found something," she said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "A story." She raised a brow. "A story," he continued, "about a widow with a fine estate, an ailing inheritance, and a companion whom she trusted until that companion became inconvenient. A story in which a suitor's obsession was encouraged, manipulated even, not out of malice, but necessity, for while Fenimore played at cults and candlelit fears, someone else prepared the real theater." She smiled faintly. "You're poetic, Mr. Holmes, but vague." Holmes stepped forward. "Not vague, Lady Sennox. Precise. You let Fenimore believe in his illusions because they served your purpose. Gideon's inheritance claims were gaining strength. Adela's loyalty was shifting. Your hold on the house, on everything, was slipping, so you brought back a specter. But it wasn't enough. When Fenimore failed, you killed him." A pause, then she laughed, not cruelly nor madly, but like a woman who had accepted something long ago. "He was going to talk," she said. "He thought it was love, but it was guilt. You were right. He would have confessed everything and too much, so I made sure he didn't." I stood in stunned silence. "But why?" I asked. "Why all this? You're a lady of wealth, position." "Wealth," she snapped. "This house is a mausoleum. My husband left it drowning in debts and promises. All I had left was the name. And now the name meant nothing until fear gave it meaning again." Holmes spoke softly. "And Miss Rowntree. She grew too curious, she found. The book." Fenimore panicked it, tried to scare her into silence. He didn't know I was watching too. He never suspected he was being watched, even as he played his part. There was a long silence, then Holmes stepped back. "Inspector Raleigh is waiting in the drawing room. I imagine you'll wish to say something clever before you go." She stood, her poise unbroken. "No, the performance is over." As she followed Holmes from the room, I glanced once more at the tokens on the table. Symbols of fear. Tokens of control. And I realized with a shudder that the most frightening illusion had not been the reversed flame, or the vanishing of a man. It had been the quiet patience of a woman who understood the true theater of power. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The dawn came slow and colorless over Thistlebank Manor, filtering through the leaded windows in a pale, indifferent haze. The house, so recently filled with deception and spectral theatrics, had fallen into a hush of exhausted stillness. No more masked figures, no more whispered secrets, just the whisper of wind through the east corridor and the reluctant creak of old beams settling into silence. But within Holmes, I saw no rest. He stood at the window of the study, gazing out toward the barren garden below, his profile as sharp as the frost gathering on the glass. "You're unsettled," I said, approaching. He did not turn. Not unsettled, Watson. Reflective. Because it's over. Because I missed the most important clue until it no longer mattered. I frowned. But surely you can't mean that. You identified Fenimore, then Lady Sannox. You exposed the entire structure of the ruse. Holmes finally turned, his eyes dark and distant. Yes, but I was distracted, Watson, as we all were. I followed the fire, the symbols, the theater, but I failed to ask the simplest question. What was the actual objective of the crime? Not its method, not its disguise, its purpose. He crossed to the desk and retrieved the velvet pouch of silver tokens. These, he said, letting them spill onto the surface again, were never meant to convince Lady Sannox of anything. She created the illusion. So who were they meant for? The question hung there between us. Holmes answered it himself. For Gideon Winstanley. I stared at him. You believe he was the intended target? Of course. The fear was designed for him. Fenimore's display in the drawing room, the false society, the whispers in the corridors. Winstanley was always nearby, always watching, always reacting. Lady Sannox didn't care whether we believed. She wanted him to believe. And to back away. Back away from what? Holmes opened the drawer of the desk and removed a document I hadn't seen before. A folded legal parchment bearing an embossed seal. I found this last night in the sealed wing. It had been torn in two and stuffed between wall panels. I pieced it together this morning. It's a deed. A deed? To Thistlebank, Holmes said grimly. A copy of the estate transfer, naming Gideon Winstanley as beneficiary, pending the legal incapacitation of Lady Cordelia Sannox. I sat down heavily. Then he was challenging her control. Yes, through solicitors quietly. Over the past 6 months, he believed she was mentally unfit to manage the estate. He had already submitted affidavits. Fenimore, in fact, had written one, before he was drawn into her spell. And when she learned of this legal challenge, she retaliated the way she knew best, through spectacle, a haunting, a tale of ancient fear. If she could create the illusion of her own madness being the least of the household's concerns, she could erode his claim before it even reached court. I whistled low, brilliant in a twisted way. Holmes nodded, and when Adela Rowantree discovered the plot, she became collateral, and Fenimore, a tool, then a liability, then a corpse. He returned to the window. Lady Sannox never intended to kill, but she was prepared to, if necessary, because for her, everything was at stake. She had built her entire existence around the illusion of control. When that illusion was threatened, she turned illusion into weaponry. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house, awakening under a new, uncertain light. Then there was a knock at the door. It was Gideon Winstanley. He looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen him. His face pale, his eyes hollow. He stepped inside with the clumsy formality of a man unsure of his place. "I came to say thank you," he said to Holmes, "for the truth, however ugly it was." Holmes inclined his head. "Truth is rarely polite, Mr. Winstanley, but it does insist on being known." Gideon glanced at the tokens on the desk. "She told me the family name was worth more than the land, that she was protecting the dignity of the house." His voice faltered. "But I never imagined she'd go that far." "She believed she had nothing else left," Holmes replied. Gideon nodded. "She'll stand trial, yes, though the Crown may take pity given her age and condition. but Thistlebank will pass to you as the deed intended." He sighed. "What am I to do with a house built on ghosts?" Holmes turned from the window. "Bury the ghosts, but keep the foundation." Winstanley left in silence. After a long moment, Holmes turned to me. "I recognized the pattern too late, Watson. This wasn't a mystery of logic. It was a story of fear. Not the supernatural kind, but the fear of being erased. That is what Lady Sannox fought against. Not Gideon, not madness, not death, but irrelevance. And she lost," I said. Holmes gave a small, enigmatic smile. "Not entirely. Even now we speak of her. In that, she has lingered, just as she wished." Outside, the wind stirred the ivy on the manor walls, and the fog began to lift. And in the dying light of a long and terrible performance, the final act was nearly ready. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The events of the past few days had begun to settle into the brittle hush that follows upheaval. Thistlebank Manor, once alive with illusion and subterfuge, now bore the strained silence of a house exhaling after a long-held breath. The fog had thinned, the halls no longer echoed with unseen steps, and yet Holmes remained alert, keen-eyed, wary. "I don't trust quiet endings," he told me that afternoon, as we walked the southern path toward the gamekeeper's cottage. "They are too often preludes." I watched him as he moved, a man who sensed, even in stillness, the stirring of some unfinished motion. "She's in custody," I reminded him. "Lady Sannox is under guard in her chambers until the inspector returns from Haslemere with formal orders. There's no one left to strike." Holmes shook his head. "It is never the one in chains we should fear. It's the one holding the key." I was about to press him when a breathless Allerton appeared from the western lawn. His hat was askew, his eyes wide with a panic I hadn't seen in him since the night of the fireplace. "She's gone," he said, struggling to catch breath. "Lady Sannox, gone from her chambers." "What?" I exclaimed. "How?" Holmes didn't ask. He was already moving, his stride long and determined. "The West Wing stair," he muttered. "It was never properly sealed." We returned to the manor at once. Oswald, the footman who had been assigned to watch the chamber door, stood pale and stunned by the threshold. "She said she wanted tea," he stammered. She was calm, soft-spoken. I turned to ask the maid to prepare it, and she was gone. The window was open, the drapes fluttering. Holmes brushed past him without a word. I followed close behind as we descended the narrow corridor behind the service stairs. Holmes paused only to check the faint scuffs along the stone tread, marks barely visible unless one was looking for them. "She's on foot," he said, "but not far, not with that limp she's always concealed behind her long gowns." We crossed the rear lawn, past the derelict stables, into the copse of trees that concealed the path to the old gamekeeper's cottage. The building had long since fallen into disuse, its roof sagging, its door warped with time. But Holmes did not hesitate. The door was unlatched. Inside, dust coated every surface save for a single trail of disturbed earth that led to the far corner where a stone slab had been recently lifted and propped open by a coal hook. "She knew this escape," Holmes murmured, "and she always kept the last word." Beneath the stone was a narrow tunnel, black as pitch, leading downward. Without a word, Holmes lit a lantern and climbed in. I followed reluctantly. The tunnel was low, forcing us to crouch as we moved. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and forgotten years. Cobwebs brushed our faces. Then, after nearly 40 yards, It ended at a wooden trap-door. Holmes paused, raised a hand, then pushed it gently open. We emerged into a forgotten chamber, dusty, low-ceilinged, with remnants of old furniture and shattered candelabras. In the far corner, seated in a tall, decaying chair like a queen on a rotting throne, was Lady Cordelia Sannox. She did not rise. "I thought it best," she said, "to be somewhere quiet when the curtain fell." Holmes stepped forward. "You were prepared for this?" "I always was," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Do you know what it means, Mr. Holmes, to be remembered only as an address, a title? The Lady of Thistlebank? To vanish into? Your own home until your name is spoken less than the house's weathered stones?" "You chose infamy," Holmes said. "I chose presence," she replied, "and presence demands performance." She held up something in her hand, a small glass vial, half filled with clear liquid. Holmes didn't flinch. "You won't take it?" She smiled faintly. "No, that would be too final. I simply wanted the choice." "You've had choices all along," Holmes said quietly, "and you chose deception. You chose to manipulate a fragile man into madness, to endanger an innocent girl, and to murder the one person who loved you beyond reason." Her expression darkened. Fenimore was weak. He lost control. "I gave him purpose." Holmes stepped forward. "You gave him a sentence, as you did to Miss Rowantree. But the story doesn't end here. You will be tried, and you will be remembered, but not as the woman who kept her estate." Silence. Then slowly, she lowered the vial. "I suppose," she said, "that even the best performances must be reviewed." Outside, the fog was finally breaking. Holmes led her from the hidden room in silence, his steps slow and even, as though walking beside the very embodiment of an era fading into dusk. That evening, as the constables took Lady Sannox into formal custody, I found Holmes again at the drawing-room hearth. He stood before the fireplace that had once burned backward, its illusions exposed, its secrets unearthed. "The irony," he said, "is that the crime was not impossible at all. It was entirely ordinary." I nodded. Fear, control, pride, the oldest motives in the book. He turned to me. "But the lesson, Watson, is far more modern. That illusion can be more potent than truth, until truth decides to perform a trick of its own." We sat in silence then, watching the fire burn forward, as it always should. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in the final clue. Revealed by the following morning, the final veil had lifted from Thistlebank Manor. Constables from Haslemere arrived with official papers, and Lady Cordelia Sannox, still draped in silks and silence, was led away under discreet escort. She did not protest. She did not speak. Her face remained composed, as though the entire sequence had unfolded according to her own unspoken script. Yet, even with her departure, Holmes showed no signs of ease. He spent the early hours walking the estate grounds alone, pausing often to examine the soil near the collapsed garden gate, or to test a rusted hinge in the sealed west wing. By the time he returned to the drawing-room shortly before noon, his eyes were sharper than ever. "There is one more piece to settle," he said, removing his gloves. "One last thread. Quiet. Buried. But too precise to ignore." I looked up from my notes. "The case is finished," Lady Sannox confessed. "Her plan has been dismantled." "What remains?" Holmes gave a small shake of the head. "A thread, Watson, and like all threads, it leads somewhere." He retrieved a small leather pouch from the inside of his coat. From it, he produced one of the silver tokens marked with the vaulter's sigil. "Do you remember this?" "Of course. I found the pouch in the sealed wing." But this particular token, he held it to the light, was not with the others. I peered at it more closely. What's different? Holmes passed me a magnifier. Under closer inspection, I saw that this token bore an engraving along its rim, so faint it was barely legible. HBC. A craftsman's mark, I asked. Not quite, Holmes said. HBC stands for Hudson Bullion Company, a private mint in Birmingham. They produced commemorative coins for a brief period during the 1870s, most notably a series known as the Legacy Marks. And this token is one of them? Yes. It was never intended to represent any occult society. It was a collectible, mass-produced, which tells us two things. First, Lady Sannox didn't invent this sigil. She borrowed it, which aligns with the Codex Nocturne being an inspiration, not a blueprint. And the second? The most damning. She didn't possess all the tokens. This one was planted later, planted after Fenimore's death. I sat forward, cold washing down my spine. Then someone else was still playing the game. Holmes nodded. Indeed, someone tried to keep the illusion alive, even after Cordelia had abandoned it. Someone who wanted the myth of the Vultus Order to survive beyond its author. But who? Holmes walked to the window, gazing out at the far tree line. When we first arrived, he said, I remarked that this house had two faces. One, the decaying majesty of the Sannox name. The other, the restless hands that kept it standing, those who lived in its shadow. He turned back to me, his voice low but charged. Oswald? I blinked. The footman? Yes, think Watson. He was present for nearly every major incident, the first to react when Miss Rowntree was discovered, the last to see Lady Sannox before her escape, conveniently absent from the cellar when Fenimore was found dead, and above all, silent. Too silent. In every interrogation, he offered just. Enough to appear useful, but never more than a servant might be expected to know. I stood. Then yes. He followed Cordelia's performance like an understudy waiting in the wings. When she faltered, he stepped forward, subtly, carefully. The final token. The whisper of footsteps outside Rowntree's room. The dislodged window latch. All details that no one would credit to a butler's hand. But why? Holmes gave a grim smile. Devotion, perhaps, or power by proxy. A servant who becomes the keeper of secrets wields more power than his master. I suspect he saw in Lady Sannox's game not just a story, but a structure. One that could continue so long as someone believed. He turned to the door. Come, Watson. We'll not see him at the manor. He'll be gone already. But there is one place we may yet catch him. The station at Haslemere. The last train departs at 2. We arrived at the platform with 5 minutes to spare. The midday train hissed quietly under the pale sky. A handful of passengers were already aboard, and there, just beyond the third carriage, was Oswald. His cap pulled low, his coat turned up, and under his arm, a long velvet box. Holmes approached, him with the confidence of certainty. Going somewhere, Oswald? The man turned slowly. His eyes did not show fear, only recognition. I suppose you'd prefer I stayed. I would, Holmes said evenly, but more than that, I'd like to know what you intended to do with the remaining tokens. Oswald was quiet a moment. Then he said, They believed it. All of them. For weeks. The sigil, the whispers, the rites. I didn't have to say a word. Just let it grow. Fear does most of the work. Holmes nodded. And the pendant? Fenimore left it behind. I only placed it where it would be found. Same with the last token. A little nudge to keep the fire burning. And if it had succeeded, Oswald looked out toward the horizon. Then I'd have returned in a few months, as a representative of a society older than time. I'd have found those desperate for belief. They always exist, especially in a place like this. Holmes held out his hand. The box. Oswald hesitated, then passed it over. Inside were 10 more silver tokens, each identical in design, each poised to begin the illusion anew. "Your train is leaving," Holmes said. Oswald did not reply. He turned and allowed the constables, alerted in advance by a telegraph. Holmes had sent from the manor to intercept him as he reached the far end of the platform. We stood in silence as the train pulled away without him. Holmes turned to me. "The story ends not with a bang, Watson, but with a whisper. It always does. That's how fear works. Not in spectacle, but in suggestion. And the tokens?" He pocketed the box. "They'll be destroyed." We walked back toward the cab, the clouds finally beginning to break above. And for the first time in days, the fire had truly gone out. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. It was a subdued evening when we returned to Thistlebank Manor. The rooms, once humming with the unspoken tension of deception, now stood hollow and strangely cleansed. The illusion that had once hung so thick in the air had dispersed, not in a dramatic unmasking, but through careful unraveling. Yet Holmes, ever the perfectionist, had one final ritual to complete. He requested the remaining members of the household convene in the grand drawing-room: Allerton, Miss Rowntree, and Gideon Winstanley. The 3 arrived just after 8 o'clock. The fire crackled quietly in the grate, flames moving in their rightful direction, as if the house itself had been set to rights. Holmes stood before the hearth, back straight, fingers interlaced behind. Him. I sat in the same armchair I'd occupied on the night of our arrival, notebook open on my lap. There was something poetic in the symmetry of it. "I thank you all for joining me," Holmes began, his voice calm, steady. "It is not often, after the dust of a case settles, that the participants gather to confront the ghost of the thing together. But I believe this case deserves such an ending." Allerton gave a small nod. Miss Rowntree clutched a teacup in both hands, the color still not fully returned to her cheeks. Winstanley stood apart from the others, arms folded, as though wary of being implicated in one last twist. Holmes continued, "You have all lived within the confines of a narrative that was carefully shaped, not by supernatural forces, but by the manipulation of perception. A reversed fire, a hidden pendant, a forged order, and ultimately a death. All threads in a fabric of deliberate deceit. Yet behind that deceit stood not one villain, but 2. Gideon cleared his throat. "You mean Lady Sannox? And the footman?" Holmes turned to him. "Indeed, Lady Sannox engineered the spectacle to protect what she saw as her legacy. But it was Oswald, your quiet, dutiful footman, who tried to preserve that lie even after her removal." Miss Rowntree gasped faintly. "But he was so invisible?" Holmes finished. "Exactly. That is the most dangerous place for power to hide." He paced slowly, his hands now clasped behind his back. "But though the deception has been revealed, the effect of it lingers. Each of you has been touched by this story in some way. Mr. Allerton, you believed yourself to be the voice of reason, yet even you found fear creeping in. Miss Rowntree, you were nearly its victim twice over. And Mr. Winstanley, you were its chosen target." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I still can't believe it, that she would go to such lengths just to keep me from the house." Holmes stopped beside the hearth and looked at him. "Not just to keep you from it, to ensure that, When the moment came, you had no appetite left for it. If her illusion had continued, you would have questioned your own sanity or left altogether. Winstanley gave a slow, bitter nod. She would have succeeded too. Miss Rowntree set down her teacup gently. "And what happens now?" Holmes offered a faint smile. "Now, the stage is cleared, the props removed, the curtain falls, and the house is yours to reclaim. But remember, illusion does not die in a moment. It lingers, in corners and memories. The important thing is not to chase it, but to name it." He walked to the table and retrieved the velvet pouch, the one filled with the silver vultus tokens. He opened it, turned it over, and let its contents spill into the fire. The flames danced around the tokens, which hissed and sparked as the metal warmed. Eventually, they fell silent, disappearing into ash and ember. Allerton watched with a kind of reverence. Holmes turned to Miss Rowntree. "I believe you will stay." She hesitated, then nodded. "If Gideon will allow it." Winstanley's face softened. "Thistlebank needs more than just a new master. It needs kindness, presence. I hope you'll stay." The air in the room seemed lighter then, as if the house itself approved. Holmes checked his watch. "And now I believe the last train back to London departs in just under an hour." Allerton stepped forward. "You've done more than uncover a crime, Mr. Holmes. You've given this place its truth back." Holmes inclined his head. "Truth is not always gentle, Mr. Allerton, but it is, I believe, the only lasting cure for fear." We departed shortly after, our carriage rolling slowly down the frost-touched road as the manor grew smaller behind us. I turned for one last glance. A candle flickered in an upper window. Not a sinister one this time, not a symbol, just light. Holmes sat beside me in silence for a while, eyes closed, arms folded. "Will it last?" I asked. The peace, he opened one eye. "Perhaps not. But for now, Watson, it is enough." And with that, we left Thistlebank behind, its secrets smoldering in the hearth, and its ghosts finally given names. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The wind moved low through the corridors of Thistlebank Manor that evening, as if the house itself were breathing a long sigh after weeks of tension. The constables had departed. Lady Sannox was confined to Haslemere Jail, and the illusion that once danced so expertly through the rooms had finally vanished into ash and memory. Yet Holmes insisted on one final act, a gathering of those who remained. At precisely 8 o'clock, the drawing-room was once again occupied. Miss Adela Rowntree sat quietly near the window, her hands clasped over a folded kerchief in her lap, her posture upright but drained. Gideon Winstanley stood at the mantelpiece, staring into the fire, with the expression of a man still uncertain whether he had won or lost. Edward Allerton took a seat near the bookcase, nervous energy twitching in his fingers as they tapped out, a silent rhythm on his knee. Holmes stood in the center of the room like a conductor before the final movement. I remained by the door, notebook closed in my lap. No words would be required tonight, only listening. Holmes began. "We gather not to relive the crimes," he said, "but to understand their logic. Deception, as you've all witnessed, is not a singular act, but a performance made effective through timing, restraint, and audience. What happened here at Thistlebank was not merely the work of a madman or a manipulative widow. It was a deliberate narrative, crafted by multiple hands, each believing themselves the author." Winstanley shifted uneasily. "You mean Oswald?" "In part," Holmes said, "but he was not the instigator. He was the custodian of the illusion once it was born. It was Lady Sannox who wrote the first line. She feared the erosion of her power, both in society and within these walls. When she learned of your legal intentions to claim the estate, Mr. Winstanley, she did not protest. She performed. Gideon's lips thinned. You're saying she allowed the fear to flourish? She did more than allow it, Holmes replied. She orchestrated it. Using the unstable but devout Phenomore as her instrument, she gave breath to the ancient lie of the Voltus order. She planted tokens, staged hauntings, and even falsified her own forgetfulness to bolster your claim of her mental deterioration, all while simultaneously undermining it with these carefully structured spectacles. Had your petition proceeded to court, Mr. Winstanley, it would have collapsed under the weight of implausibility. But why attack Miss Rowantree? Lurton asked. Holmes turned to the young woman, because she noticed what others did not. The duplicate signature in the guest book, the forged entry covering a torn page, the book of symbols. She alone saw the edges of the mask, and that made her dangerous. Adela's voice was quiet. I didn't know what it meant, only that something was wrong. That, said Holmes, was more than enough. He returned to the hearth, where the fire crackled low, casting golden light on the tokens he now laid upon the table. What remained of the pouch found in the hidden wing. These were part of the performance, he said, letting them fall in a metallic hush, a currency of fear, borrowed from a long-forgotten fraud, and polished into something timeless. Each token reinforced the myth. But myths require keepers. And when Lady Sannox's myth threatened to unravel, someone else stepped in to preserve it. Oswald, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. A silent observer, shaped by long years of servitude, invisible, overlooked, yet keenly aware of the power that secrecy offers. When Lady Sannox faltered, Oswald didn't abandon the myth. He attempted to inherit it. He fed the legend, planted fresh evidence, and ultimately sought to replace fear with belief. He would have become the next high custodian of an order that never existed, if only someone had followed him into the darkness. There was silence when Stanley lowered his eyes to the fire. Holmes continued, and then came the murder of Fenimore. That act was not planned. It was a desperation, a moment in which the myth turned violent. Cordelia Sannox did not kill for madness or revenge. She killed because silence, to her, was survival. Allerton looked up. But how did you know? Before the final clue, what tipped you off? Holmes turned slightly. It was the reversal itself. I leaned forward. The reversed fire. Yes, Holmes said, a symbol meant to defy logic. But the moment it defied physics, I knew it must be man-made. No fire burns downward without a mechanism or a trap. And once that was true, everything became performative. Once illusion enters the room, it casts suspicion on every element. He walked slowly back to the center of the room, surveying the assembled faces. We are creatures shaped by what we see, but ruled by what we fear. Lady Sannox understood that. Oswald did too. Fenimore was merely the first to believe in his own illusion. Adele arose. And now? Holmes gave a faint, tired smile. Now the house must breathe again. The fire must burn forward. Let truth, not fear, be its warmth. She nodded and sat once more. Gideon Winstanley looked to Holmes. What should I do with the place? That, Holmes said, is not my decision. But if you wish for its ghosts to remain buried, I recommend you let its doors remain open. The flames behind him flared briefly before settling, and so, as Holmes concluded his quiet recital of deception and human frailty, The room held its breath, then slowly, steadily, began to breathe again. Chapter 16. The reveal Holmes breaks down the crime. The next morning, Holmes and I departed Thistlebank for London, but not before Holmes gathered the remaining household members one last time. He had requested the gathering be held in the study rather than the drawing-room. "Symbolism has its place," he said, and though the day was grey, the room itself was bright with morning light and a kind of wary expectation. Gideon Winstanley arrived first, now seemingly more composed, but still bearing the haunted look of a man who had nearly lost both his inheritance and his peace of mind. Miss Rowantree followed, subdued but attentive, a quiet steadiness in her posture. Edward Allerton, dependable to the end, stood near the fireplace, arms folded. Holmes wasted no time. "You all deserve a proper explanation," he began. "Though the pieces have been laid out over the course of our investigation, the pattern has not yet been fully revealed. This, then, is the true account of what transpired at Thistlebank." He moved to the writing desk and withdrew a folded chart, a hand-drawn timeline of events. "Let us begin at the beginning, not with the fire that burned backward, but with a legal document." He held up the deed fragment we had recovered from the sealed west wing. This deed, torn and hidden, established that Mr. Winstanley, as next of kin, would inherit Thistlebank in the event Lady Sannox was deemed legally unfit to manage the estate. Mr. Winstanley began proceedings several months ago, quietly gathering evidence of his aunt's eccentricities. Winstanley said nothing, merely lowering his gaze. "Lady Sannox discovered this," Holmes continued, "and she knew, despite her composure, that the law could be bent against her. Rather than respond through courts and letters, she chose the medium she knew best. Illusion." He turned to the fire. "She created a narrative, one in which Thistlebank was haunted, cursed, and mystifying. She enlisted the help of Dr. Fenimore, who was already emotionally compromised, and offered him a role in the theater of deception. Fenimore, in love and already fragile, was easily manipulated. He created the backward fire, using magnesium and chemical compounds, hidden in a niche behind the hearth. He forged the pendant and the parchment, invoking the false cult of Vultus. "But why such theatrics?" Miss Rowntree asked. "To cast doubt on the very notion of reality," Holmes replied. "If the house was plagued by unnatural forces, then the legal case against Lady Sannox would become unprovable, perhaps even laughable. No judge would trust a man trying to wrest an estate from a woman said to be hosting demons." A faint, bitter smile touched Winstanley's lips. "She outplayed me. She nearly outplayed everyone," Holmes said, "but her performance depended on one fragile player, Fenimore." And he began to fracture. When Miss Rowntree discovered the duplicate guestbook entry and the Codex Nocturne, Fenimore panicked. He struck her and hid her in the cellar, not out of cruelty, but to protect the story. Adela's knuckles whitened slightly, but she nodded. "Then came the first turning point," Holmes continued. "Fenimore was caught, and at that moment he became a threat to Lady Sannox. If he confessed, her entire plan would collapse. So she silenced him." Holmes placed a finger on the timeline. She drugged her guard with tea, slipped from her room using a forgotten servant's passage, found Fenimore in the secondary tunnel, and killed him using the ceremonial blade, an old hunting knife kept in the West Wing for decades. Allerton's voice broke the silence. And then, she returned to her room and waited to be found. It was, in its own way, another performance. She knew the law was closing in, but she preferred to exit with a measure of control. She intended to flee once again the next morning, through the same passage before charges could be formalized, but she was intercepted. "And Oswald?" Winstanley asked. "Oswald was the understudy," Holmes said simply. "He watched the entire charade unfold and saw its potential. When Lady Sannox was arrested, he began planting fresh evidence to sustain the myth. A second pendant. A final token. He hoped to keep the story alive, and eventually to take ownership of it." "He never spoke," Allerton whispered. "Never drew attention." "Because power doesn't always speak," Holmes said. "It watches, and when it sees weakness, it steps forward." He turned to each of them. The backward fire was the first lie. Everything that followed, fear, violence, or even death, was its reflection. The case, in the end, was not about cults or ghosts. It was about control. Who held it, who lost it, and who pretended they never needed it. A long pause followed. Then Gideon Winstanley stepped forward. "And now?" "Now," Holmes said gently, "you rebuild. Not just walls or gardens, but the truth of what this house is, and what it isn't." Miss Rowntree looked at Holmes. "And you? Will you write about this?" I answered before Holmes could. "I shall," I said, "but the facts will speak for themselves." Holmes smiled faintly, turned to the fire, and added one last note to the chart, before folding it again. He looked to each of them, then simply said, "The curtain has fallen. Let the actors rest." And with that, Holmes and I departed the room, leaving behind the final shape of the truth, and a house slowly learning how to breathe again. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. We returned to London 2 days later, and it was not long before the headlines followed us. "Heiress of Thistlebank, arrested in elaborate hoax and murder," blared the morning edition of the Daily Telegraph. Beneath the bold letters, the article offered a sanitized version of events, omitting the true complexity of the illusion, the subtle madness of Fenimore, and the quiet ambition of Oswald. Holmes, for his part, paid it no mind. "The newspapers," he said over breakfast at Baker Street, "deal in exaggeration and exclamation points. Truth, by contrast, prefers quiet corners and careful pacing." Yet even Holmes could not ignore the flurry of correspondence that arrived. The Home Office requested a statement. Scotland Yard, predictably, claimed partial credit. Inspector Lestrade, to his amusement, sent a short congratulatory note with a flourish of unintended irony. "Fine work on the country case. They say fire doesn't lie, but I suppose even flames can be taught to behave." Still, what mattered most was the outcome. Lady Cordelia Sannox was transferred from Haslemere to Holloway Prison, where she awaited formal charges for murder, fraud, and obstruction of justice. She maintained her silence throughout every hearing, speaking only to confirm her name and date of birth. Her lawyers, well-connected, discreet, and clearly instructed, argued diminished responsibility, citing her emotional instability and the manipulative influence of the late Dr. Fenimore. Holmes was called as a witness. When asked if he believed Lady Sannox to be mad, he replied simply, "She is not mad in the sense the law would define it. She is rather aware. Dangerously so. Her mind is clear, but her conscience is weathered. That is not madness, it is calculation." His words would be quoted for days afterward. Miss Rowntree, at Holmes's insistence, was never called to testify. Holmes saw to it that her involvement remained peripheral in the official narrative, enough for her to be respected, but never scrutinized. When I asked him why, he said because she endured what the rest of them merely observed. And those who suffer in silence deserve, at the very least, the dignity of privacy. Gideon Winstanley was named sole proprietor of Thistlebank, though he petitioned to convert half the estate into charitable grounds, a school for orphaned girls, to be run in part by Miss Rowantree. Holmes approved of the gesture, even if he suspected it was partly driven by guilt. As for Oswald, he was arrested without resistance and charged with complicity and attempted obstruction. His trial was brief. He admitted to planting the final token and interfering with the investigation, but denied any knowledge of Fenimore's murder. The court believed him. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, a surprisingly lenient judgment which Holmes predicted precisely. "The court sees a butler," Holmes explained. "They do not see the architect beneath the uniform, but even illusionists must rest eventually." One quiet evening, several weeks after the case had ended, I found Holmes at his desk, writing a letter. The lamp was low, the room still. "Tater." "Whom?" I asked. "Gideon Winstanley," he replied, sealing the envelope with wax. "He has written to thank me and inquire whether I would consider visiting once the house is restored. Apparently, he wishes me to see it without ghosts. And will you?" Holmes looked thoughtful. "No, I do not visit empty stages." I paused. "Do you think he'll manage it, rebuilding Thistlebank?" He considered this, with the right support, yes, but not as a monument to blood or inheritance. The house must become something new, or it will always burn in one direction or another. He rose then, crossed to the fireplace, and placed the remaining silver token, the last one he had kept, into the flames. It blackened, hissed faintly, and was gone. "I kept it to remind myself," he said, "of what? That even the greatest minds, when left unchecked, will construct illusions so convincing they forget they're the ones pulling the strings." He turned from the fire. "In that, Watson, lies the most dangerous mystery of all." I closed my notebook and set down my pen. There was nothing more to write, only to remember. The case of the reversed fire had ended not with a grand arrest or a final gunshot, but with a slow reveal of how belief, illusion, and fear had been twisted into something lethal. The ghost had never been a spirit. It had been an idea, a dangerous one, and like all ideas, once revealed, it could no longer hold power. So we let it go, as Holmes reached for his violin, the bow arcing with ease across the strings. I leaned back in my chair and allowed the notes to carry us forward, into the calm beyond the case, where no flames burnt backward, and all shadows finally aligned with the truth. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. Some weeks after the case of the reversed fire had been concluded, and its many threads carefully untangled, I found myself once more at Baker Street, enjoying one of those rare golden afternoons where London was mercifully quiet. The clouds had parted above Marylebone, and Holmes had permitted himself an indulgence, his violin, sunlight pouring through the window, and a single blue-bottle fly, whose drone he matched note for note until the creature, defeated or humiliated, buzzed its way elsewhere. I sat opposite him, newspaper folded, untouched. "Holmes," I said at last, "do you ever reflect on the cases that almost deceived you?" He lowered the violin with a slight smile. "Almost Watson." I chuckled. "Very well. Cases that required you to walk closer to the edge than usual." He set the instrument aside and folded his long fingers together. "Yes," he said, "Thistlebank was such a case." I leaned forward. "Because of the complexity?" "No," he said, "because of the elegance." He rose and began to pace, not restlessly, but with the slow, thoughtful gait of a man reciting something private to himself. "There are crimes born of desperation, and crimes born of greed. These are easy to identify. But then there are crimes born of architecture, designs constructed with purpose, patience, and performance. Lady Sannox was no genius in the sense, but she understood atmosphere. She understood how to let others draw the wrong conclusions while she simply set the stage. I nodded. The backward fire, the pendant, the books, even the silence. Precisely, Holmes said. She weaponized ambiguity, left just enough space for imagination to fester. That is rare, and it is dangerous. He paused at the window, watching a carriage roll past. But she miscalculated something vital. She assumed that fear, once ignited, could be directed, contained. What she forgot is that fear, like fire, spreads. It reached Fenimore, who became unstable. It reached Oswald, who became ambitious. And in the end, it consumed her. Holmes turned to me. Control, Watson, is the grand illusion. We believe ourselves masters of our stories, but once fear takes root, it begins to write its own chapters. I studied him in silence for a moment, then said, "You once told me that truth prefers quiet corners. Do you think the truth survived Thistlebank?" His eyes softened. "Yes, because it was named. That's all truth requires. Not applause, not acceptance. Merely to be seen and spoken aloud." I opened the newspaper at last, scanning the page. The story had all but vanished from the headlines now. A small column on page 4 detailed Lady Sannox's formal committal to an institution, neither condemned nor cleared, but placed somewhere in the middle, as befitted one who lived in shadows. No mention of Oswald, no mention of the tokens, and certainly none of the Holmes. He had, as ever, removed himself from the limelight, allowing the law and the world to draw their own neat conclusions, while the messy reality was left for private reflection. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "Solving it too completely, I mean." Holmes gave a faint laugh. "No, but I do wish, sometimes, that the world knew how close it comes to believing in things that were never real." He crossed to the hearth, where a single flame flickered. In the grate, a fire that burned backward, he said, almost to himself. "The perfect metaphor." I raised a brow. "For what?" "For how we remember," he replied. "Not as it happened, but as it felt, in reverse, through smoke and distortion." And with that, Holmes returned to his violin and began to play. Not a dirge, but something light, almost playful. A tune that danced, flirted, and faded with the last breath of winter. The performance was over, but the music, like the memory of the case, would linger. And somewhere, in the quiet corridors of a forgotten manor, the ghosts of fear had finally been named and were at last at peace.